I'm going to tell you something that happened to me last winter, and I know most of you won't believe it. Hell, I wouldn't believe it either if someone told me this story, but my therapist says writing it down might help with the nightmares. And my wife Emma keeps insisting I need to get it off my chest. So here goes. My name is David Carlson, and I've been working as an independent timber harvester in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. For the past 14 years, I'm 44 years old, grew up in rural Vermont, where my grandfather taught me everything about sustainable forestry, chainsaw safety, and reading the wilderness. He was French-Canadian, tough as nails, and he used to tell me in his thick accent, "David, we don't own the forest. The forest allows us to visit. Sometimes it doesn't want visitors at all." I never really understood what he meant until February 22nd of this year. My work is seasonal. During the warmer months, I do carpentry and construction. But when winter hits and people need firewood to heat their homes, that's when I make most of my income. A properly seasoned cord of white birch or sugar maple can fetch $300, sometimes more. I've built up a solid reputation over the years. David Carlson delivers quality firewood, properly cut and stacked. The work is backbreaking, felling, limbing, bucking, splitting, hauling, but there's something pure about it. You're working with your hands, reading the land, understanding which trees are already dead and which storms brought down good timber. The place where everything happened is what the locals call Timber Ridge. Though it's not marked on any official maps, it's about 2 hours west of Conway, deep in the White Mountain National Forest, accessible only by an old Forest Service road that's barely maintained. In winter, you need serious four-wheel drive and chains just to make it up there. The road climbs about 9 miles through dense spruce and birch forest until you reach an abandoned lumber camp from the 1960s. Back in the day, this was a major operation. There's still remnants of the old camp scattered around. Collapsed bunkhouses, rotted loading platforms, rusted equipment that was too expensive to haul out when they shut down operations. My friend Pete Sullivan worked for one of the big timber companies before they closed, and he told me there were always rumors about this place, workers reporting strange sounds at night, equipment mysteriously moved, that kind of thing. But Pete also believes in alien abductions, so I never put much stock in his stories. What I do know is the timber up there is incredible. The harsh winters kill trees every year, white birch weakened by ice storms, sugar maples that have reached the end of their lifespan, standing dead timber from bark beetle infestations. With the proper permits, you can harvest deadfall and standing dead trees, and if you know where to look. You can find enough quality wood to stay busy all season. My favorite area is about half a mile beyond the old lumber camp, where an old logging road follows a ridgeline through a section that was hit by a wildfire about 12 years ago. The fire killed thousands of trees, but didn't completely devastate the forest, so you've got this perfect combination of standing dead timber, dried by years of sun and wind, and new growth coming up underneath. Some of that birch is so dry it practically splits itself. That Saturday morning in February started like any other workday. Emma had driven down to Boston to visit her mother, so I had the whole weekend to myself. The weather forecast was perfect, cold but clear, with about 18 inches of snow on the ground from the previous week's storm. Perfect conditions for cutting wood. The snow provided good traction without being so deep you couldn't maneuver. I'd been planning this trip for 2 weeks. One of my regular customers needed 4 cords delivered by mid-March, and I was short about 2 cords. I loaded my truck Friday night with all my equipment. My primary steel MS 462 chainsaw with a 20-inch bar, a smaller Husqvarna for detail work, extra chains, bar oil, about 4 gallons of pre-mixed fuel, and all my safety gear. Hard hat with face shield, Kevlar chaps, steel-toed boots, heavy gloves. I also packed my emergency supplies. Emma always jokes that I pack like I'm planning an Arctic expedition instead of a day trip. But I learned my lesson 5 years ago. when I got stuck in a snowdrift 15 miles from the nearest plowed road and had to spend the night in my truck. Since then, I always bring a bivvy sack, camp stove, extra food, first aid kit, emergency radio, hand warmers and spare batteries, better over-prepared than dead, and I brought my rifle, a Remington 730-006 that I keep in a locked case behind my seat. I don't usually carry it for firewood work, but something had been bothering me about my last few trips to Timber Ridge. I'd been hearing unusual sounds, branches breaking when there was no wind, strange vocalizations that didn't sound like any wildlife I was familiar with. A few times I'd found large tracks in the snow that didn't match moose, bear, or any other animal I knew. Pete Sullivan had mentioned seeing similar signs when he'd been up there the previous winter. He claimed he'd found what looked like a shelter made of broken branches, and he swore he'd seen something massive moving through the trees about 100 yards away. When I pressed him on what it looked like, he just shook his head and said, "I don't know, Dave, but it wasn't walking on 4 legs." At the time, I chalked it up to Pete's overactive imagination, but as I'd started noticing more unusual signs myself, I began to wonder. The rifle was just insurance. I left my house in Berlin at 5 in the morning, wanting to reach Timber Ridge by sunrise. There's something special about being in the mountains as dawn breaks. The way the light hits the snow, the way the forest transitions from night sounds to day sounds, the way everything feels fresh and new even when it's 10 degrees below zero. The drive was uneventful. The old Forest Service road was in decent shape. Someone had plowed it recently. Probably the Forest Service preparing access for winter patrols. I pulled into the old lumber camp just as the eastern sky was turning pink. The place looked exactly like it always does in winter, buried under snow, abandoned, both peaceful and slightly eerie. There's something haunting about abandoned places, especially places that were once full of workers and activity. It makes you think about how temporary everything really is, how quickly nature reclaims what we think we've permanently altered. I sat in my warm truck for a few minutes, drinking coffee from my thermos and planning my day. The weather was ideal. About 15 degrees, no wind, crystal clear skies. I could see ravens circling overhead, which usually meant a carcass nearby, probably a deer that didn't survive the cold snap. I geared up and started hiking to my cutting area. The old logging road is well defined, but I've walked it so many times I could do it blindfolded. It winds through mixed forest, white birch, sugar maple, eastern hemlock, with an understory of mountain laurel and blueberry bushes completely buried under winter snow. In February, the whole landscape is monochrome. White snow, dark trunks, deep blue sky. The road climbs gradually for the first quarter mile, then levels out and follows the ridge contour. You can hear wind in the trees long before you feel it, and snow crunches under your boots with that distinctive sound that only happens in extreme cold. When I reached my cutting area, I took a moment to just appreciate it. Morning light was filtering through the canopy, creating beautiful shafts of golden light on the snow. Standing dead trees cast long shadows, and I could see fresh tracks where a fox had passed through during the night. I set up methodically, the way my grandfather taught me, found a good staging spot with easy access to the trees I planned to cut. Filled both chainsaws with fuel and oil, checked the chains for sharpness, made sure all safety equipment was properly secured. You always do a safety check before working alone in the backcountry. A chainsaw injury miles from help can be fatal. The first tree I selected was a standing dead white birch, about 16 inches in diameter. It had been killed by bark beetles a few years back and was perfectly seasoned. I made my assessment cut, checked for widowmakers in the canopy above, planned my escape route and started the saw. The stile roared to life. The tree fell exactly where I wanted it, landing in a shower of snow and frozen bark. I limbed it quickly, then began bucking it into 16-inch rounds. The wood was so dry, the saw cut through it like butter. and that sweet smell of fresh-cut birch filled the cold air. This is the satisfaction of the work, turning a dead tree into useful fuel, knowing this wood will keep someone warm through winter. I worked steadily for about 3 hours, felling and bucking 4 trees. The sun had climbed higher, and even though it was still cold, I'd worked up enough sweat that I had to remove my outer jacket. I'd accumulated a good pile of rounds, probably enough for 3/4 of a cord once split and stacked. I was preparing to drop another tree when I noticed movement on the far side of the clearing. At first, I thought it was moose, but as I looked more carefully, I realized something was off. They were maybe 200 yards away at the edge, where the burn area met old-growth forest. What struck me immediately was how they moved, upright, through terrain that should have been nearly impassable. Deep snow, thick deadfall, steep terrain. There were 6 or 7 of them, and even from that distance, they were big, really big. My first thought was that it might be a group of hikers, maybe some hardcore winter campers. But nobody comes up here in February. The trails aren't maintained, there are no facilities, and the weather can turn deadly in hours. I didn't think much of it initially. The forest is big enough for everyone. I went back to work, starting the chainsaw to begin another cut. The saw's noise drowns out everything else, so I was concentrating on my felling cut when I felt more, then heard something approaching. I shut off the saw and turned around. The group had moved much closer, maybe 80 yards away now instead of 200. That's when I got my first really good look at them and my stomach dropped. These were the biggest people I'd ever seen. I'm not small, I'm 6 feet tall and weigh 190, but every single member of this group was significantly larger than me. The biggest one, clearly leading the group, had to be close to 8 feet tall and probably weighed 500 pounds. But it wasn't just their size that was unsettling. It was how they moved, too fluid, too effortless through the deep snow, like their weight barely registered and their proportions seemed wrong. Arms too long, shoulders too broad, heads too large and oddly shaped. I tried to convince myself I was seeing things. That distance and bright sunlight on snow were playing tricks. Maybe they were just very large people wearing bulky winter gear. But as they continued moving toward me, I became increasingly certain something was very wrong. They weren't carrying any equipment, no chainsaws, no axes, no sleds for hauling wood. They weren't wearing typical winter gear either. Instead, they seemed to be covered in dark, shaggy material that looked almost like fur. The sounds they were making got louder as they approached. The vocalizations didn't sound like English or any language I was familiar with. It had a different quality, lots of low-pitched grunts and huffing, noises mixed with what sounded like clicking. I was getting genuinely nervous, but I didn't want to abandon my work area without reason. I'd driven 2 hours to get here. I'd already cut a good amount of wood. Besides, I was probably just being paranoid. I decided to keep working but stay alert. I started the chainsaw again and began cuts on the next tree, trying to act natural while keeping one eye on the group. They had stopped moving and seemed to be gathered around something in the snow. I could hear what sounded like excited chatter, and occasionally one would point in my direction. After a few minutes, they started moving toward me again. I decided the polite thing would be to shut off the saw and acknowledge them when they got close enough. Maybe I could establish that I was here first and had claimed this cutting area. But as they got closer, my uneasiness grew. Their movement was too graceful for their size and the depth of snow. They barely seemed to sink into the drifts, despite their obvious bulk. And their proportions were definitely wrong. Arms too long, legs too thick, heads too large. I started noticing other details that didn't make sense. Their gait was different. They covered ground with fewer steps than they should need, like their stride length was much longer than a person's. When they stopped to examine something, they would squat down in an almost ape-like position, balancing easily on their haunches in a way that would be uncomfortable for most humans. Their covering looked less like clothing and more like thick fur or coarse hair. dark brown or black, and it seemed to be part of their bodies rather than worn over them. What really caught my attention was their social behavior. They clearly had a hierarchy. The largest one was obviously the leader. When it made gestures or vocalizations, the others responded immediately. There seemed to be a family structure too, with what appeared to be adults protecting and guiding younger ones. The youngest member, and by youngest I mean smallest, which was still probably 7 feet tall, was staying close to what I assumed were its parents. Every so often, one of the adults would reach out and touch it on the shoulder or head, like they were reassuring it. When they were about 50 yards away, I got my first clear look at their faces, and my blood went cold. These weren't people. Their faces were heavily covered with coarse dark hair. Their foreheads were prominent and sloped backward. Their jaws jutted forward unnaturally. Their eyes were small, deeply set, and seemed to reflect light in a way human eyes don't. When they moved their mouths to communicate, I could see teeth that were larger than human teeth, more prominent canines. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing. The rational part insisted this had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe people in elaborate costumes, maybe the bright sunlight creating optical illusions. But another part of my brain, the part shaped by growing up in Vermont forests and working in New Hampshire wilderness for 14 years, was telling me I was in the presence of something I'd only heard about in stories. These were Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call them. They were real, they were here, and they were heading directly toward me. I tried to stay calm and think about my options. I could pack up and leave, but that meant turning my back on them and hiking half a mile to my truck. I could stand my ground and hope they'd move on, or I could try to interact somehow, though I had no idea how to communicate with a Sasquatch. While I was deciding, they solved the problem by stopping about 30 yards from my position. They seemed to be having a discussion among themselves, occasionally pointing toward me and my equipment. The largest one made a series of gestures that the others seemed to understand. I decided to continue working and act like nothing unusual was happening. Maybe if I ignored them, they'd ignore me. I pulled the starter cord on my chainsaw. It roared to life. The sound startled them. They all stepped back, making agitated vocalizations. But then the youngest one seemed particularly interested. It kept moving closer, watching intently as the chain spun around the bar. The adults were making warning sounds, but the young one was fascinated by the mechanical object. I positioned myself to cut a fallen log, trying to focus on my work while keeping one eye on the creatures. The saw bit into frozen wood, throwing sawdust and ice crystals into the air. The young Sasquatch moved even closer, now only about 15 feet away. I was concentrating on finishing the cut when I heard the tone of vocalizations from the adults change. They'd gone from curious to alarmed. I released the trigger and let the saw idle, turning to see what caused the change. The young Sasquatch had moved right up to my work area and was reaching toward my saw with one massive, hairy hand. "No, don't!" I shouted, then tried, "Stop!" But either it didn't understand or didn't care. Its hand moved closer to the still spinning chain. I quickly shut off the saw, but it was too late. The chain was still moving from momentum, and the young creature touched it with its fingertips just as it came to a stop. The chain was still hot from friction, probably close to 200 degrees, and the creature let out a howl of pain that echoed through the forest. It yanked its hand back and stumbled away, holding its burned fingers and making distressed sounds. The other Sasquatches immediately began moving toward us, their body language shifting from curious to threatening. I could see the largest one baring its teeth and making deep, rumbling vocalizations that sounded like a cross between a bear's growl and a human's angry shout. I held up my hands, trying to show I meant no harm. Wait! It was an accident. I didn't mean to hurt it." The young one was still crying out in pain, and I could see blistered skin on its fingertips where it had touched the hot chain. Without thinking about the danger, I moved toward the young Sasquatch. I grabbed a handful of clean snow and approached it slowly, speaking in what I hoped was a calming tone. "Here, here, snow helps burns. It's good for burns, let me help." I don't know if it understood my words or my intentions, but it held out its hand tentatively. I gently pressed the snow against the burned fingers, using more snow to cool the damaged skin. The young creature winced, but didn't pull away. I kept applying fresh snow to the burn, trying to reduce the heat and prevent further damage. The other Sasquatches had formed a semicircle around us, watching intently. I could feel their eyes on me, could sense the tension in the air. The young one seemed to be calming down. The snow was helping, and it was making quieter sounds now, more whimpering than crying. I was so focused on treating the burn that I didn't see the leader moving up behind me. I didn't hear it approach over the sound of my own voice, trying to soothe the young one. The first indication something was wrong was when one of the other creatures made a loud, sharp vocalization, a warning or signal. I started to turn around, but I was too slow. The last thing I remember was seeing a massive fur-covered arm swinging toward my head. Then everything went dark. When I woke up, everything was different. I was lying on my back, looking up at a sky that had gone from clear blue to the gray of late afternoon. I tried to sit up and immediately discovered I couldn't move my arms or legs. I was tied down to something that was moving, sliding across snow with a rhythmic swishing sound. As my vision cleared and my head stopped spinning, I realized I was lashed to some kind of sled being dragged through the snow. The sled was surprisingly well constructed. Several long, straight branches lashed together with what looked like twisted strips of bark. The runners were smooth and curved, designed to glide efficiently over snow. The bindings that held me were incredibly strong, much tougher than anything I could break with bare hands. I was tied spread-eagle across the sled. My head was positioned so I could look up at the sky or turn slightly to see the snow-covered forest sliding past, but I couldn't sit up. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows. Based on its position, I estimated it was late afternoon, which meant I'd been unconscious for several hours. I had no idea how far I'd traveled or where I was. My head was pounding where I'd been hit. I could feel dried blood in my hair and beard. I was also incredibly cold. My jacket was still on, but the constant motion through frigid air was leaching away my body heat. The motion had a steady rhythm. I could occasionally hear sounds ahead. Heavy breathing, the crunch of feet in snow, and those same strange vocalizations. Someone or something was pulling this sled. And based on everything that had happened, I was pretty sure it wasn't a rescue team. More than the physical discomfort, I was grappling with the psychological impact. I'd encountered a family of Sasquatches, accidentally hurt one of their young, and somehow ended up as their prisoner being dragged through the New Hampshire wilderness on a handmade sled. It was so far outside normal human experience that part of my mind kept insisting I must be dreaming or hallucinating. From the head injury, I tried to remember what happened after I'd been hit. Had they built this sled specifically to transport me? How long had I been unconscious? The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. Why build a sled at all? If they wanted to get rid of me, why not just leave me unconscious in the snow? If they wanted to kill me, why not finish the job? The only explanation that made sense was that they were removing me from their territory without killing me. By putting me on a sled and dragging me away, they were ensuring I'd be far from their home by the time I regained consciousness or was found. It was actually a sophisticated solution, which spoke to a level of intelligence I hadn't expected from creatures that were supposed to be more animal than human. As afternoon wore on, I watched scenery slide past and tried to get my bearings. We were moving through heavily forested terrain that all looked the same in winter. Lodgepole pine, spruce, the occasional stand of birch, all covered in snow. I could see occasional breaks where old logging roads or clear cuts had created openings once I glimpsed what might have been a power line in the distance. I also started noticing wildlife signs. Several times I glimpsed deer tracks in the snow. Once I saw what I was sure was a bobcat track crossing our path. There were pine marten tracks and snowshoe hare tracks. Once I saw an eagle perched in a dead tree watching us pass. But mostly it was just trees. Mile after mile of snow-covered forest stretching in every direction. This part of New Hampshire is vast and wild, with hundreds of thousands of acres of national forest that see very few visitors, especially in winter. I could be anywhere, and without landmarks, I had no way of knowing exactly where. The isolation was both beautiful and terrifying. The pristine wilderness, the clean, cold air, the scent of pine and frozen earth, it was magical. But the vastness made me acutely aware of how small and helpless I was. If something went wrong, if these creatures abandoned me here, if I somehow broke free but couldn't find my way back, I would almost certainly die from exposure. The temperature was already dropping as the sun got lower, and once darkness fell, it would easily reach 0 or below. Without shelter or fire, I wouldn't last the night. I was being pulled at what felt like a good pace, probably 3 or 4 miles per hour. If I'd been unconscious for several hours and the sled had been moving the whole time, I could be anywhere from 15 to 20 miles from where I'd started. As the sun started to set, I began to seriously worry about spending the night tied to this sled. The temperature was dropping significantly, and I was wearing work clothes designed for active labor, not lying still in sub-zero temperatures. My fingers and toes were starting to go numb. I could feel myself shivering uncontrollably. I also worried about other hazards. If we crossed rough terrain, I could be injured by branches or rocks. If we crossed steep slopes, the sled could break free and slide. If we crossed rivers or streams, I could break through ice and drown. Just as I was starting to panic, the motion changed. We seemed to be descending now, moving down a slope. The pace slowed, as whoever was pulling me had to control the sled's momentum on the downhill grade. Through gathering darkness, I could see we were entering different terrain, more open, with fewer trees and what looked like frozen meadows. The snow here was deeper and more windswept, forming drifts and strange shapes. We crossed what must have been a frozen creek, and I heard ice crack ominously under the weight of my captors and the sled. The temperature continued to drop as full darkness fell. I was shivering so hard, my whole body was shaking. I could no longer feel my extremities. My teeth were chattering uncontrollably. I knew hypothermia was setting in. If I didn't get warm soon, I would slip into unconsciousness and simply freeze to death tied to this sled. I tried to stay awake, tried to keep moving whatever parts of my body I could to generate heat, but I could feel myself slipping away. The stars came out overhead, brilliant in the clear, cold air, and I found myself staring up at them, thinking about Emma, wondering if I would ever see her again. I must have lost consciousness because the next thing I knew, it was starting to get light again, and I was incredibly stiff and cold. Every muscle in my body ached from lying in the same position for so many hours. I couldn't feel my hands or feet at all. My face felt frozen, and when I tried to move my jaw, it barely responded. The sled was still moving, but the motion had changed. We were on flatter ground now, and the pace had picked up. I turned my head as much as I could and saw the scenery had changed dramatically overnight. Instead of dense forest, we were crossing what looked like a broad valley with scattered stands of trees and open meadows. In the distance, I could see mountains rising up, their peaks catching the first light of dawn. As the sun climbed higher, my situation became increasingly desperate. The sun, reflecting off snow, was blindingly bright, and without sunglasses or any way to shade my eyes, I was forced to squint against the glare. My skin felt tight and cracked from the combination of cold, wind, and sun exposure. I was so thirsty I could barely swallow. My mouth felt like cotton, and my lips were cracked and bleeding. At one point, we passed close enough to a snowdrift that I was able to turn my head and get some snow on my lips, but it wasn't nearly enough. The day wore on in a blur of pain and discomfort. Sometimes I drifted into unconsciousness. Sometimes I was jolted awake by a bump or sudden change in direction. I lost track of time completely, measuring hours only by the movement of shadows across snow. We crossed several more frozen streams and climbed over at least one significant ridge. At one point, we passed close to what looked like an old cabin, but we didn't stop, and I couldn't muster the strength to shout for help. As the second afternoon wore on, I started to hallucinate. I saw Emma walking beside the sled, talking to me. I saw my grandfather, dead for 15 years, standing in the snow, shaking his head sadly. I saw spirits from old stories dancing in the trees. I was so far gone that I almost didn't notice when the sled finally came to a stop. We'd arrived at a small clearing near a frozen pond, the Sasquatches. I could see them clearly now in the late afternoon light, gathered around the sled and seemed to be having a discussion. The leader approached me and looked down with those intelligent alien eyes. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, this massive fur-covered creature and this half-frozen logger. Then it reached down and began cutting the bindings that held me to the sled. I was free, but I was so weak and cold I couldn't even sit up. The Sasquatches stood there for another moment watching me. Then they simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the forest as silently as they'd appeared in my cutting area 2 days earlier. I lay on the sled in that clearing for what felt like hours, too weak to move, too cold to care. The sun was setting again, and I knew that if I didn't find shelter soon, I would die there. But my body simply wouldn't respond to what my brain was telling it to do. I was drifting in and out of consciousness when I heard a sound that at first I thought was another hallucination, the high-pitched whine of a snowmobile engine. The sound got closer, and suddenly there were voices, real human voices speaking English. "Jesus, there's someone here! Call it in. We need medical right now." "Sir, can you hear me? Sir, we're going to help you." Hands were lifting me, wrapping me in blankets, pressing something warm against my skin. I tried to speak, tried to tell them what happened, but all that came out was a croak. "Don't try to talk. You're going to be okay. We've got you now." The snowmobile patrol, part of a search and rescue team Emma had sent after I didn't come home, loaded me onto a rescue sled and transported me to a waiting ambulance. I spent 4 days in the hospital being treated for severe hypothermia, frostbite on my fingers and toes, dehydration and concussion. The search and rescue team told me I was incredibly lucky to be alive. Based on where they'd found me, I'd been dragged approximately 28 miles from where my truck had been located at the old lumber camp. The route I'd taken went through some of the most remote and rugged terrain in the White Mountains. When they asked what happened, I tried to explain about the Sasquatch encounter. The search team was professional. They nodded and took notes. But I could see in their eyes they didn't believe me. The police who interviewed me later were more openly skeptical. "Mr. Carlson," one said, "you're telling us that Bigfoot tied you to a sled and dragged you 28 miles through the mountains?" "Yes," I said simply. "That's what happened." "Sir, with all due respect, you suffered a severe head injury and hypothermia. It's very common for people in those conditions to experience hallucinations and false memories." "I know what I saw," I said carefully. "It was real." They exchanged glances that told me they thought I was either lying or mentally unstable. Eventually, they determined I hadn't committed any crimes and wasn't a danger to myself or others, so they released me. Emma was waiting at the hospital, and the look on her face when she saw me was a mixture of relief, anger, and bewilderment. She'd been terrified when I hadn't come home Sunday night, and she'd called the sheriff Monday morning to report me missing. "David," she said as we drove home, "what really happened?" I told her the whole story, just as I've told it here. To her credit, she listened without interrupting or expressing disbelief. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "You know," she said finally, "my uncle used to tell stories. He was a forest ranger in Oregon for 30 years, and he said that everyone who worked deep in the mountains long enough had a story about something they couldn't explain. He never gave details, but he said that there were things in the old-growth forests that science hasn't catalogued yet. That was the first time I'd heard Emma mention those stories. It made me feel less crazy to know other people who'd worked in wilderness areas for years, had their own encounters with the unexplained. In the weeks that followed, I researched everything I could find about Sasquatch sightings. I was amazed by how many reports there were, thousands across the Pacific Northwest and New England. Many from within 50 miles of where my encounter occurred. I contacted researchers who study these encounters. One professor explained that what I'd experienced, the protective response when their young was hurt, the decision to transport me away rather than kill me, suggested advanced intelligence and even moral reasoning. They neutralized a perceived threat while minimizing harm to all parties, he told me. That kind of sophisticated problem-solving is usually associated with species that have complex social structures and advanced cognitive abilities. I also learned that the area where I'd been cutting wood has a particularly high concentration of reported sightings. The old lumber camp and surrounding forest has been the site of numerous reports over decades. Strange sounds, equipment disturbances, sightings of large, unidentified creatures. Pete Sullivan told me the old timber company had received numerous reports over the years from workers about unusual encounters. The official policy was always to dismiss them as hoaxes or misidentifications, but Pete said privately many long-time workers believed there was something genuinely unusual about that part of the forest. I've been back to the old lumber camp a few times since, always with Emma, always during daylight. The area feels different to me now, more watchful, more alive. I get the sense I'm being observed whenever I'm there. Though I've never seen signs of the Sasquatch family again, I did find the spot where I'd been cutting wood that day. I was able to recover some equipment that had been left behind. My chainsaw was still there, along with my smaller saw and other gear. Interestingly, everything was arranged in a neat pile, as if someone had collected it deliberately. My truck, which the search team had found, was completely undamaged. I've tried to return to normal wood-cutting routines, but it's been difficult. Every time I'm alone in a remote area, I find myself looking over my shoulder and listening for sounds that might indicate I'm not alone. The encounter has changed my relationship with the wilderness in ways I'm still trying to understand. Some people have suggested I should report my experience more widely, but I'm not sure I want that attention. I've read about others who've gone public with encounters, and many faced ridicule and harassment. I have a business to protect, a wife to think about, and a reputation in my community. But I also feel an obligation to share what happened, if only to let other people know. There are things in our forests we don't understand and probably shouldn't take for granted. The creatures I encountered were intelligent, organized, and capable of complex problem-solving. They were also incredibly strong and potentially dangerous if provoked. Most importantly, they seemed to have their own way of dealing with human intrusion into their territory. They didn't kill me when they could have, but they made it clear I wasn't welcome. The fact that they built a sled and transported me safely away suggests a level of restraint and even compassion I wouldn't have expected from a purely wild animal. I think about that young Sasquatch sometimes, the one that burned its fingers on my chainsaw. I hope it healed well and learned to be more careful around human equipment. I also hope my attempt to help sent a message that not all humans are threats. The whole experience has made me more humble about humanity's place in the natural world. We like to think we're the dominant species, that we understand and control our environment. But my encounter reminded me that there are still mysteries out there, still wild creatures that operate according to their own rules. I don't know if I'll ever have another encounter like the one I had in the White Mountains. Part of me hopes I will, because there are so many unanswered questions. But another part is content to respect the boundaries these creatures have established and remember that some experiences are too profound to be easily explained. What I do know is I'll never look at the deep forest the same way again. Every time I see old-growth timber or hear an unexplained sound in the woods, I'll remember that there are things sharing this world with us that are older, stronger, and perhaps wiser than we are. So that's my story, for whatever it's worth. I know some will believe it and others won't, and I'm okay with that. I've learned that truth doesn't always depend on whether other people accept it. Sometimes the most important truths are the ones we carry quietly within ourselves, the ones that change how we see the world, even if we can't convince anyone else to see it the same way. The experience has fundamentally altered my relationship with the natural world. Before that day, I thought I understood the wilderness. I'd been working in these forests for 14 years, and I felt like I knew what lived there and what didn't. But my encounter shattered that confidence and replaced it with something deeper, a recognition that the natural world is far more complex and mysterious than I'd ever imagined. I think about the intelligence I saw in that young Sasquatch's eyes as I was pressing snow against its burned fingers. There was awareness there, recognition, perhaps even gratitude. It understood I was trying to help, just as I understood its family was trying to protect it. In that moment, we connected across the vast gulf that separates human and non-human consciousness, and I realized that intelligence and emotion aren't exclusively human traits. The more I've reflected on the experience, the more I've come to believe these creatures represent something we've lost as a species, a way of living in harmony with the natural world that doesn't require dominating it. They've managed to survive in one of the most developed regions of the country while remaining essentially invisible to our technology and scientific institutions. That suggests a level of environmental awareness that far exceeds our own. Emma has noticed the change in me, and she's been incredibly patient as I've tried to process what happened and what it means. She started coming with me on more woodcutting trips, partly because she's worried about my safety, but also because she's genuinely curious. "Maybe," she said to me one evening as we sat by the fire, "maybe the reason these creatures have stayed hidden so long is because they're waiting for us to grow up enough to handle the knowledge that they exist. Maybe they're testing us, one person at a time, to see if we're ready to share the world instead of trying to control everything in it." I think she might be right. The Sasquatch family could have killed me easily, but they chose a different path. They demonstrated both power and restraint, intelligence and compassion. They showed me there are other ways of solving problems, other ways of dealing with conflict. The forest is still out there, stretching across the mountains, keeping its secrets close. And somewhere in the deep woods, a family of creatures that shouldn't exist according to our scientific understanding continues to live their lives, following patterns that probably predate human civilization by thousands of years. I feel privileged to have glimpsed that hidden world, even if the experience nearly cost my life. It's a reminder that mystery and wonder still exist in our increasingly mapped world, and that sometimes the most extraordinary encounters happen when we least expect them. The wilderness is teaching me patience, humility, and respect. It's showing me there are forms of intelligence and ways of being that exist outside human understanding, and that our role in the natural world might be very different from what we've assumed. We might not be the apex species we think we are. We might not be the only conscious, reasoning beings on this planet. We might be sharing our world with others who've been here longer, who understand it better, and who have lessons to teach us if we're willing to listen. I still cut firewood, though I'm more careful now about where I go and how long I stay. The wilderness still calls to me, just as it always has. But now I listen more carefully to what it's trying to tell me. Sometimes, when the wind blows through the pines in just the right way, I think I can hear voices in the forest. Ancient voices speaking in a language older than words, reminding me that I'm a guest in their world, not the other way around. That's something worth remembering, whether you believe in Sasquatch or not. In a world becoming increasingly artificial and disconnected from natural processes, we need reminders that we're part of something much larger and older than human civilization. We need to remember that wisdom doesn't always come from books or laboratories. Sometimes it comes from the deep forest, from encounters with the unknown, from experiences that challenge everything we thought we knew. My encounter in the White Mountains was terrifying, humbling, and ultimately transformative. It opened my eyes to possibilities I'd never considered and forced me to question assumptions I'd held my entire life. I wouldn't trade that experience for anything, even knowing the fear and confusion it caused. Because in the end, it taught me the most important lesson: that the world is still full of magic and mystery, still full of wonders we haven't discovered or explained. And as long as there are wild places left, as long as there are forests and mountains that remain largely untouched, there will always be the possibility of encountering something that changes everything we thought we knew. That possibility, that sense of wonder, is what keeps me going back to the wilderness, not just to cut wood, but to maintain my connection to something larger and more ancient than myself, to remember that I'm part of a web of life that includes creatures I may never fully understand, but that I can learn to respect and appreciate. Who knows? Maybe someday, if I'm patient enough and respectful enough and lucky enough, I'll have another encounter with the unknown. Maybe I'll get another glimpse into that hidden world that exists parallel to our own. Until then, I'll keep working, keep exploring, keep listening to the voices in the forest. And I'll remember that every time I step into the wilderness, I'm entering a realm where anything is possible, where the extraordinary can happen at any moment, where the boundaries between human and non-human, known and unknown, possible and impossible, become beautifully and mysteriously blurred.